One is for belonging, for attachment, for connection, because without that, the child doesn't survive. The young child is helpless, dependent, needs to be taken care of. So attachment is an absolute need. But we have another need, which is to be ourselves, to know our emotions, because our emotions are there to protect us, and to be able to express our emotions, and to be able to act on them. Now, in too many families in this world today, when children express their genuine emotions, their anger and so on, the parents can't accept that.
Yes.
The parents are scared of the child's anger. The parents want the child to comply. They want the child to be who they want the child to be. And then the child, because they have to belong, they have to attach, they suppress their authentic selves in order to belong. So they forget how to say no. And they take on too much. So they don't protect their boundaries anymore. Now here's the thing. The mind and the body can't be separated. The human organism is designed so that our emotions and our physiology are completely one unit. Unfortunately, Western medicine, the medicine I was trained in, doesn't recognize that unity. So we tend to see things only biologically and physiologically, whereas our physiology is very much affected by our emotions. So when children suppress their no, they're actually suppressing their immune system and they're affecting their nervous system and so on. And that's where disease comes from. So what I'm saying is that disease is actually a way of the body saying no when a person didn't say no. So when I talk to people, and I've talked to many people from Romania actually, multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, autoimmune disease of all kinds, the commonest characteristic that they share is that they don't know how to say no. They keep working to fulfill other people's demands and to satisfy other people's expectations, and they don't know how to listen to their own emotions. So that's what I'm saying. When we don't know how to say no, the body will say no for it's in the form of some kind of illness.
You know, Dr. Marta, and you know this for sure. Obviously, you know that. In our culture, when you say emotion, when you pronounce the word emotion, sometimes this is received, interpreted as something not very serious. When you say emotion, emotion doesn't matter. You shouldn't be emotional. You should be self-possessed. You should be calm. You should be very yourself, but rational.
Yeah. Yes. So this is turning things on upside down. Because how human beings evolved is that the emotions came first. The rational intellect came only second. In fact, the rational intellect was constructed on the scaffolding of emotions. So there's emotional systems that we share with other mammals. We have a system for rage. We should have a system for rage, because if somebody enters my boundaries and threatens me, I should have a rage to protect myself or to protect my young ones. We have a system in the brain for caring, for loving. That's essential, because without that, the young creature just doesn't survive. We have a system for lust. Obviously, without lust, there's no procreation, there's no new generations. We have a system for seeking, for exploring. We have a system for fear. We should have a system for fear.
Yep.
Because without fear, we get into trouble. We have a system for anxiety and grief, panic and grief. So we have all these emotional brain systems, and we had them before we had rationality. Other animals have them too. So the rationality came along as an evolutionary development much later in the game. And unless the rationality is connected to the emotions, it's not really rationality. It's a disconnected rationality. So in human development, the emotional part of the brain, the right side of the brain, develops before the rational left side of the brain. I'm talking about it in not just historical also, as each person is conceived and born, the right side, emotional side. So the rational brain is then based on the scaffold of a healthy emotional brain. If that emotional brain is not healthy, then you have rationality that's completely distorted. And in the Western world, we put all the emphasis up here. I'll tell you one more thing. We think we have a brain up here, and we do have a brain up there, but we also have a brain in the heart. The heart is a nervous system, and so does the gut. So really we have three brains. And when the three are connected, then we are grounded. When we're only coming from up here, we're totally disconnected from reality. You can see this in politics. People can have all kinds of beliefs that have nothing to do with reality because they're not connected to the heart and the gut.
Sometimes when we talk about three brains, or scientists in general will tell you that this is something which is not serious. The brain is the only one which is here in the head. This is not science when we talk about three brains. What would you answer?
Well, then, they don't know the science. I mean, it's not. I'm not making this up. You know, the heart has a nervous system. There's a science that studies the nervous system and the heart. It's called neurocardiology.
Yeah.
The gut sends more connections to the brain than the brain sends to the gut. When we talk about gut feelings, well, let me ask you this question. I often ask this from audiences. Have you had the experience of having a strong gut feeling about something, ignoring it, and then being sorry afterwards that you ignored your gut feeling?
Yes, definitely, yes.
Yes, that's because the gut feelings are telling you about reality. So these scientists, they don't know the science.
Dr. Martin, there's a thought which is wandering in many of our minds. And this thought sounds like this. I'm sick because I'm guilty. And sometimes there are even medical doctors who will tell you, you're ill, but you deserve this because your behavior was bad, so you deserve this. It's devastating when a medical doctor tells you that.
Yeah. And there is a danger that in what I'm saying, people get that kind of a message, which is not the message I intend. Now let's take an obvious example. Somebody smokes and they get bronchitis.
Yep.
Well, clearly there is a link between the smoking and the bronchitis. So you might say, you're guilty. You caused your bronchitis. But why did the person smoke? And in my book on addiction, I talk about this. People smoke because it soothes their brains. Why do their brains need to be soothed? Because they were traumatized. So that the smoking or the drinking, they're not because somebody decided to make themselves sick. They're because somebody needed to escape from some very difficult emotions and they didn't know how else to do it. That's because they were traumatized. So I don't blame anybody for any disease. Now, when I say to people, you have multiple sclerosis because you have been suppressing your emotions all your life and you've been too nice and you haven't known how to say no, I'm not blaming anybody because not saying no and suppressing their emotions was how they survived their childhood. It's not a conscious decision not being made. It's not like they woke up one morning and they said, I'm going to suppress my emotions. I'm going to not say no. No. That not saying no and that suppressing of the self was how they survived their childhood. It's how they survived their childhood trauma. Later on, that same adaptation becomes a source of illness. But they're not guilty. They didn't do it deliberately. They didn't even know they were even doing it. On the other hand, if you're diagnosed with multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, and I know people in Romania who've been through this, and you realize that it's not just a physical, biological, isolated, unexplainable event that happened to you, but it's a consequence of your trauma and your emotional life, then you can take responsibility. You can change it. You can change how you relate to yourself, and that can change your disease. So there's no guilt, but yes, I'd like people to take responsibility. That will help them get better.
And to make it very clear, you didn't say, and you never say, you should drink, you should smoke, because this is blowing up your guilt. You never say that.
I'm not saying, by the way, I never say to anybody what they should do. I just say, here are the consequences of what you do or what you don't do. But all I'm saying is that even if somebody drinks or somebody smokes, I don't blame them for it, because there's always a reason, which has to do with emotional pain that they're trying to soothe. So why should I blame them?
How can we define stress? We should do that, because regardless of the culture, regardless of the country, in most cases, we will hear these words. Yours is not at all stress. You don't know what stress is. I know what stress is. That is not stress. What is stress, Dr. Martin?
Well, so stress is basically when something that you need, you're threatened with the loss of it. Now, stress in itself is not a bad thing. For example, if I were to threaten you right now, I can't do it. I can't threaten you too much because we're thousands and thousands of kilometers away from each other. But if I were to threaten you right now, you should be stressed. So stress is a physiological response to a threat. So if I were to stress you, your heart rate would go up, your muscles would get tighter, and you get ready to fight or to escape.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's a good thing. And in order to allow that to happen, there has to be a physiological stress response in your body, which would have to do with many factors, but ultimately the release of the stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. And so that's a good thing. So short-term stress is simply a physiological response to a threat. But then there's chronic stress. Chronic stress, the short-term stress, and the stress response can save your life. But chronic stress can threaten your life, because those same stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, that in the short term help you maintain your resistance, in the long term thin your bones, ulcerate your intestines, make you depressed, put fat on your belly so that you're more likely to get heart disease, and they suppress your immune system. So you might define stress as either short-term or long-term pressure on the organism. And if you look at the research on stress, the triggers for stress are lack of information, uncertainty,
And losing
loss of control, and conflict. And I have to say one more thing. If I were to stress you, but you weren't all by yourself, but you would ask for help from somebody, that would help to relieve your stress. So human connections relieve stress. The more isolated people are, the more stressed they are. And that's why people will, and in the modern world, there's an epidemic of loneliness. People are much more lonely than they used to be, even a few decades ago. And so when you're lonely, you don't have the same capacity to resolve your stress. And so lonely people, they get sicker faster and they die much faster of their disease. So you have to put stress not just in an individual context, but in a social context.
Dr. Martin, can one experience deep stress without being completely aware of that?
Yes, if early in life you have to suppress your, and this is what happens in trauma, is you get disconnected from yourself. You don't even know what you feel anymore. I mean, look, for me, for decades, people ask you, how are you feeling? and I get angry. I have no idea how I'm feeling. I knew what I was thinking, but I didn't know what I was feeling.
Yeah.
I was disconnected. Why was I disconnected? Because as an infant, so many terrible things were happening that the way I survived was to disconnect from my feelings, because the feelings were unbearable. If I'm disconnected from my feelings, then I don't know that I'm stressed. But that doesn't mean that I'm not stressed.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are very stressed and they don't know it. Not only that.
Is there stress of existing? Because you talk about this stress of existing, about an inherent stress. And in your own words, it's very painful to be ourselves. End of quotation. Which is the core of this pain of being ourselves?
Well, it's only painful to be ourselves if other people don't accept who we are. If people accept who we are, then it's joyful to be ourselves. For the young child, it's very painful to be themselves if the environment doesn't see them, hear them, accept them, value them, celebrate them for exactly the way they are. Then it's very painful to be themselves. So I need to clarify that.
Yep.
And then life becomes a search for oneself. A lot of people, it takes them decades to find themselves again. And it's very joyful when they do. But I've forgotten what the other question you were asking in connection with this. What was the whole question again?
The whole question was that there must be a root, there must be a core of the pain of being ourselves. Which is that core of the pain of being ourselves?
Oh, it's only what I just said. That if we're ourselves and that threatens our relationship with the people that we're connected to, it's very painful. A lot of people can't stand that pain. So they'd rather take on the beliefs and the values and the behaviors and the expectations of their families, of their society, of their culture, than to say, no, that's not me, that's not what I feel, that's not what I believe, I'd rather be alone than to be connected in a false way. Most people can't stand that pain. Most people can't. Anywhere in the world. And unfortunately, we do that to our kids too often, that we make it very painful to be themselves.
In your own words, you question yourself, which is a rhetorical question, and you say, why are parents so unable to see the pain of their children? End of quotation. And you obviously refer to the inner pain of their children. Why the parents don't see that pain, Dr. Martin?
Because they don't see their own pain. This is multi-generational. So that when I was a young parent, and I have 3 adult children now, often I behaved in ways that really hurt them. I didn't mean to hurt them. It wasn't my intention. I wasn't even aware that I was hurting them. But that's because I hadn't understood and felt my own pain. So it has to do with one generation after another, unwittingly, without meaning to, passing on that pain to the next generation, and not even realizing that they're doing it.
Dr. Martin, there's a triad, which is emotion, stress, illness. I will come back to emotion. We were talking about emotion at the beginning of our meeting, but please let me ask you a little bit more about emotion, because often we have a deep misunderstanding of this idea, of this concept. What is emotion, as a matter of fact, Dr. Martin?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? It's a word that we use all the time, and it's so hard to define it. But emotion is mental state that's associated with the physiological state in the body. So if there's a lot of tension and aggressive energy arising in my chest and in my face, in my head, I'm going to call that emotion anger. And if there's an opening and a softness and a gentleness and a tenderness in my body when I'm looking at another person, I'm going would say emotions are mental states associated with physiological states.
You also talk about emotional competence. Please define that.
Yeah. Well, fundamentally, I mean, in the book I talked about it at some length, but fundamentally, emotional competence is being in the present moment and responding to what's happening in the present, not determined by some past event or some past experience. And it's also knowing what I feel in the present moment and being able to express that. So, very often in my life, I'd get all upset about something. And I think I was getting upset about what was happening in the present. But actually, afterwards, I realized, no, this is some past stuff that's arising here. I'm not in the present moment at all. So emotional competence is knowing what I feel in the present moment and being able to act on it in an effective way, but not confusing the present with the past.
Dr. Martin, may I kindly ask you a very personal question?
Sure.
You should be a person immensely loaded with an unimaginable burden of the shadow of death, as you have seen and been the last companion for many people before they passed away. How do you cope with that?
Well, okay, I understand what you're saying. Thank you. So yes, I did work in palliative care, and I looked after a lot of dying people. And we have this, there's a word called thanatophobia, fear of the very concept of death. And in Western society, we're very death phobic. Now, we're all afraid of dying. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about we're afraid of even facing death and talking about death.
Yes.
And most traditional societies are much healthier that way. So in Mexico, they have every year, they have the Day of the Dead. And they go have picnics at the graves of their loved ones. And they dance and they eat, you know.
And also have this in Eastern Europe as well.
Yes, I know. And in Eastern you have such traditions, and you have traditions of mourning. You know, there's in Ireland, they will come and keen and chant for days. The Jewish ceremony of Shiva, where people sit with the bereaved, you know, for a few days. Every culture, every healthy culture, understands and accepts death. So when I was working with these dying people, it was a wonderful education, because you realize, intellectually we know this, but you realize experientially that death is just another aspect of living, that in itself it can be beautiful, depending on who's experiencing it and how well accompanied they are on that dying journey. So my own experience as an infant, and as a Jewish infant in Hungary, and you know the history there.